Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute Constitution Series, Equality and Justice for All. I'm Chevy Humphrey, a member of the O'Connor Institute Board of Directors, and on behalf of Justice O'Connor and the Institute, we are delighted to have you with us. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Spencer Crew. Dr. Crew has worked in public history institutions for more than 30 years. He is currently the acting director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He is on leave from George Mason University, where he is the Clarence J. Robinson Professor of History. Previous to Mason, he served as president of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center for 6 years. And he also worked at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution for more than 20 years. 9 of those years, he served as the director. At each of those institutions, he sought to make history accessible to the public through innovative and inclusive exhibitions and public programs. He has curated numerous exhibitions, the most recent one at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Crew also has published extensively in the areas of African American and public history. His latest book is Thurgood Marshall, A Life in American History. He is a graduate of Brown University and holds a master's degree and a doctorate from Rutgers University. As we begin our program, we invite you to send in your questions during our question and answering following Dr. Crew's presentation. You may also use either the YouTube live chat or leave a comment on Facebook. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Spencer Crew.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and thrilled to have a chance to talk with you a bit and to share a bit more with you about the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where I'm located. Now, the story for this museum really begins more than almost 100 years ago. And it has to do with the arrival of African American Civil War veterans who are in Washington, D.C., celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Civil War. As they traveled around the city, what they recognized was that there were no monuments to African American history or cultural contributions anywhere in the city. So what they decided to do was to lobby the federal government to create some sort of monument or museum to begin to recognize those contributions. The challenge was that there was no real momentum behind this for many, many years, because we're looking at the turn of the 20th century. It's really not for almost 70 or 80 years that real momentum got started to get work on the museum begun. And that happened because of the efforts of one particular man specifically, and that's John Lewis, who just passed away. When he took up the struggle to create the museum probably in the late 1980s. And I think it reflects the impact that he had on the museum and how important he was to the creation of our institution. We are the 19th museum created by the Smithsonian Institution. We were established by an act of Congress passed in 2003. Congressman Lewis was a co-author of that bill and helped to sponsor the legislation in order to make it happen. He also pushed past a lot of criticism and a lot of resistance to submit this bill more than 15 times before it finally was passed by Congress, and then signed into law by then President Bush. The work then he then had to work very hard to make sure that we got funding in order to have the money to help build the museum. Our founding director, Dr. Lonnie Bunch, came to begin working on the museum in 2005, and after that, the staff and the size of the collection began to grow. What was interesting is that when we began, we had no collection. And we really had to go out and talk with people and begin to dig around and find material to include in the museum. You'll be happy to know now that we have more than 400,000 objects we've been able to identify and make use of for the museum. After Lonnie Bunch came on board, we then had an international competition to decide upon the design of the museum. Selected to do that were David Adjaye and Philip Freelon, who offered a really unique design for the museum. Based upon David Adjaye's background, they chose an African motif for the building. The building itself has a corona shape that is inspired by a 3-tiered crown used by Yoruba artists. The main entrance has a really wonderful, large, welcoming porch that also has connections to its African roots. And the bronze color of the exterior of the building really pays homage to African American ironworkers who created ironwork in both Louisiana and South Carolina. So we're really trying to make sure the building reflected African American culture and history. What's also important, though, is that the museum is located on the National Mall, because having it located there, I think, indicates how important African American history is to American history and how important it is to have it part of that story told on the National Mall of this country. We broke ground for the building in 2012 and opened the building in September of 2016. Since then, we've had more than 7 million visitors come to the museum to experience what we have to offer. And we think we've created a very special experience for those visitors. Most people who come to visit now stay 4 or more hours to go through everything in the museum. And they often come back out saying they have to come back to see more. To give you a sense of this, the average time that a visitor normally stays at a museum is probably about 2 hours. So we are very happy with the kind of response we're getting from our visitors. Now, unfortunately, with the arrival of COVID-19, the experience that people have in many museums and in ours has shifted because we cannot let people come into the building to actually be a part of what we have there. So that's similar to the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute at our museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We have always seen our role as a convener of dialogue. Prior to March, we did that mostly through our programming that we conducted inside of the building. We had many different public programs that were directed towards creating these kind of dialogues. I want to share a couple of them with you. Among them was a program called Seat at the Table. And in that program, what we would do is to invite participants from a cross-section of communities with a variety of points of views, a variety of experiences, to come in and sit down and share dinner together, family style, and to create different people at the table so the conversation was great varied. They'd eat dinner, we'd have a speaker talk about a particular topic, and then we would encourage dialogue among the people who were at the tables. Once the dialogue was completed, they reported back out to others who were around the room. Some of the topics that were covered at these meetings were things such as social justice, religion, culture, identity, and community. So these were things we wanted people to think about, to grapple with, and really to hear other points of view so that they came away with a broader perspective around these issues. Now, along with the seat at the table, we also had a number of programs that were really focused at trying to help our younger visitors to the museum. And I think we've been very inventive and creative in that way. Among the programs we have for younger visitors is a program called Cultural Cuddles, which is directed towards infants and younger. We have Toddler Treasures that are directed towards 1 to 3-year-olds. And what these programs try to do is to begin to get them to be much more comfortable with the concept of diversity and differences. So we talk about things like colors and faces and music, expose them to different kinds of these things, and with the idea that they will become more and more comfortable with things that are different. And we also then try to tie it into our collection. So we might have them look at it, talk about something like Chuck Berry's Red Cadillac. So we have a color, but also a car. And we also have them talk about such things as skin color and developing a positive self-image so that as they go out and leave that, they feel positive about themselves, but also feel positive about differences that exist in our society. We also have had exhibitions in the museum that spark conversations between visitors as they explored our galleries. We have history galleries, culture galleries, galleries that talk about community. And what we're trying to create is what we call our brave spaces for conversations, where people can come in and intersect and really talk with one another and learn from one another as they go through the building. Now, while the museum has been closed to the public, we have sought new ways to try to intersect with our audiences and to get them to have a chance to take advantage of what we have to offer. And most of this we've tried to do online. I think online technology has become the new direction, the new focus for our museum, as for many other museums across the country, as we've had to close our doors and to find other ways to share what we have to offer. So on our online presentations, we have a number, I think, of very interesting items available to people. For example, we have a video walkthrough of our latest changing exhibition on World War I called They Returned Home Fighting. And what it does is to look at the experiences of African-American soldiers during, before, and after World War I to see what their experiences were, to see how they sacrificed for the nation and what they faced when they came back. That tour is complete with video, with audio, and with a partial tour by the curator for the exhibition. So it gives our visitors a chance to get a firsthand introduction to what it has to offer. The other thing that we're creating and working on very hard is what we call the Searchable Museum. It's a platform that will allow students, researchers, and the public to explore our collections online. And what it will do is expand our access, the access that everyone has to our collections and to the Smithsonian overall. This way, more students and individuals all across the country can have a chance to look at and get involved with the objects that we have to share. We have made this a priority for the museum during COVID-19 times, but also we believe that as we go further and further into the future, this will become another important tool that we'll have available. That's particularly important because everyone's not going to have a chance to get to Washington, D.C. to visit the museum. So this way, through this platform and through our online activities, we'll be able to allow them to have that interaction. And that way, they will have a chance to intersect with what we see as some of the core values of our institution in terms of looking at issues around culture and history and other issues. What we believe is that the museum has to exist just beyond the walls of our museum. And we have to provide access to our resources for everyone, not just those who are lucky enough to come to Washington, D.C. We also have worked to host digital programs that can convene thoughtful conversations at the museum. And they are also connected to our ongoing mission. Last month, we hosted a conversation among experts on the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 is having upon African Americans and other vulnerable communities. We did this by looking at the history of pandemics in the African American community, looking at the impact it's had economically and on health issues within those communities, so we can see how COVID is really having a different kind of impact there. We've also seen the museum serve as a gathering place and assembled during the protests that have taken place, the social protests that have taken place around the country. When we also often saw people in our galleries and in the museum itself having conversations with each other about what was taking place there, about the issues raised and about the issues taking place in the country. We often saw strangers talking to one another and trying to exchange information and sharing their impressions about what they were seeing. Even now, even as we're closed, as the protests have continued, especially in Washington, D.C., our museum is drawing people to it who see it as a symbol of social justice and the need for social justice in our country and for equity, so that we continue to be, I think, an important symbol for many people in this country and the struggles that they're facing and the steps they believe need to happen going forward. Now, one of the things of particular interest to me during the last few months is that we have continued, even while we're closed, to continue our work on some ongoing exhibitions that we hope to have open once the museum is reopened to the public sometime we hope in the next year or so. The exhibit that we're working on presently is an exhibit on Reconstruction, that time period that happened after the Civil War. Now, for me, it's a chance for me to put on my curator's hat, which I haven't worn for a while, and to really think about the content that our museum is trying to provide for the country. The exhibition itself on Reconstruction will chronicle the efforts of newly freed people who are searching for equality and justice after the end of the Civil War. And it's interesting if you think about it in the context of our museum itself, because in the museum itself, when you would come into it and go to the history exhibitions, the first section you go through would be the section that looked at the slave trade and life in Africa, which would be a very dark, closed space. From there, you'd go into a much larger space where we talked about the Revolutionary War. That gallery, as I said, opened up into a much larger space, and lining the walls as you first come into that space are the founding documents of our country, of the United States. These are the documents that talk about liberty and justice and equality, and how these are sort of the founding concepts and principles of our nation. In front of them are stories about enslaved individuals. And what this compels our visitors to do is to really engage with the question about the meaning of freedom and who is entitled to all the rights of citizenship as our new nation gets up and running. Our exhibition on Reconstruction will look at another, I think, revolutionary period in the history of our country, where the political and social and economic issues are coming straight to the forefront as the nation transitions from the Civil War to post-Civil War time. I think Reconstruction is a time that compelled Americans to grapple with these fundamental questions of freedom and what it means to be an American. And also, it is the first time in the history of our country that slavery was no longer legal in all parts of the country. And it meant, how were we going to exist in a nation that no longer had slavery as the baseline part of its operation? And to find out what that meant going forward. What we want to look at in this exhibition is the story from the perspective of the newly freed individuals after the end of the Civil War and the challenges they faced as slavery disappeared. We also, though, want to think about their accomplishments that they were able to make as free people no longer chained down by slavery. Very often, Reconstruction is depicted as a tragedy and pretty much as a failure. What we hope to do is to show more than that. We want to show the nuances that come with this period in time and understand better, not just the failures, but also the successes, which are also characteristic of this point in time. And also the experiences of the individuals who were swept up into this new time in the history of the nation. Now, very much importantly, as part of this, what we want to look at is the passage of the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. These were some of the most significant gains that took place after the Civil War as part of Reconstruction. And people very often overlook how important they are to the nation then, but I'll talk about a little bit later how important they are to the nation today. Now, normally when we talk about these amendments, the 13th Amendment gets most of the attention because it is the one that ends slavery and is a very critical new direction for the museum. But I think the 14th and the 15th Amendment have just as much impact and are just as important as the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution confers the rights of citizenship. It says that citizenship applies not just only now to African Americans, but to other men who were excluded from the rights of citizenship under the original Constitution. Keep in mind that you had to own property for a long time before you were really seen as a true citizen. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution defines the right to vote. And what it says is that you cannot use race, color, or your previous status and servitude to prevent people from voting. So they're saying that just because you've been a slave before doesn't mean you can say I couldn't be able to vote now. The challenge with these laws, which were created by the Reconstruction Republican government, is that as quickly as they're passed, they face challenges and everyday application and challenges in the courts. There's lots of resistance to conferring the rights that are inherent in both the 14th and the 15th Amendment to these newly freed individuals. A lot of people believe they didn't qualify to be citizens and therefore should not get the rights that these two amendments offered. And steps were taken very quickly to try to undermine the intent of these two amendments. This is especially so the case in the South. And what they would do is try to undermine these through the creation of new laws that would try to control the free people. These are such laws as black codes, which were directed towards keeping African Americans under control, and Jim Crow segregation laws, again directed towards keeping African Americans at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. And what we can see is that what helps these laws to blossom is a series of court cases that upheld these laws and greatly aided discrimination and violence against African Americans. And I want to talk about several of these Supreme Court decisions to understand how they impacted how the laws themselves were applied. The first one I wanted to mention is the 1883 United States versus Harris decision. In this, the court held that it was unconstitutional for the federal government to penalize crimes such as assault and murder in the states. It was not the federal government's jurisdiction, according to the Supreme Court, to prosecute these kind of crimes. They declared that only local governments have the power to offer penalties under these crimes. What this does then is to essentially say that local communities had the option of deciding what they would prosecute and what they wouldn't. And what it wound up doing is creating this void where crimes created and directed towards African Americans were largely ignored, especially in southern locations, in terms of the people who committed the crimes, especially they're committed towards African Americans. And so as a result, it took federal oversight away from such things as prosecuting lynchings and attacks on many Black African American men and women, particularly in the South. The perpetrators of these crimes were not held accountable at all by many of the local governments in the South. So you could see that violence to dissuade African Americans from voting, from expressing their social and civil rights, were allowed to be directed towards these communities. The other court case of importance is the 1876 case of United States versus Reese. This court case was directed towards undermining the rights of African Americans to vote. In this case, a Kentucky election official refused to register an African American voter, and he was indicted or brought up on charges using the 15th Amendment as the reason, saying he had used their color as the reason for not allowing them to vote. What the court said, in essence, was that you are right. You cannot use color or your previous condition of servitude as a rationale for stopping a person to vote. But what they also added was that you can use other devices to stop people from voting as long as you don't use those characteristics as the key reasons for preventing it. So what this allowed many states to do is to use other devices to stop African Americans from voting. And you began to see this pop up in a number of states in a number of locations across the country. Soon thereafter, in 1889, Florida wrote a new state constitution that included the idea of the poll tax. That is, the idea that you had to pay money in order to have the right to vote. The challenge for this, especially for African Americans, many of whom were sharecroppers who did not have much money, they did not have the funds to be able to pay a poll tax to be able to vote, so therefore they were excluded. Then the same concept was added to other new constitutions in southern states, along with other devices that were put in place that did not talk about color or your previous condition of servitude, but did find ways to exclude African Americans without saying African Americans. So, for example, in 1890, in Mississippi, in their new state constitution, they used a device called the literacy test, which basically said that when you went to register to vote, the registrar would give you something to read, and they would decide whether or not you could interpret it properly. The irony of this is that if you were African American and had a PhD, very often you could not read it properly according to the registrar, whereas many other people could. So again, it was a way of preventing selected people from voting without using color or your previous condition of servitude. Probably the most interesting device that was put in place during this time period was included in the 1898 Louisiana new state constitution, which used the concept of what was called the grandfather clause. Essentially what it said was that anyone whose grandfather could vote in the state before 1867 could vote under the new constitution. If your grandfather did not vote before 1867, you had to meet new education and property or tax requirements in order to vote. This was very, very, I think, interesting because what we knew is before 1867, most African Americans in Louisiana were enslaved and therefore their grandfathers could not vote. So again, this was a very, I think, interesting and indirect way of keeping African Americans from having the right to vote in these locations. You could see this being applied in other states, such as Virginia, where I'm located, where in their new constitution, they were able to create segregation in every area of life in the state. They created segregated schools, movie theaters, restaurants, water fountains, even libraries and books in the libraries in order to keep Black and white patrons apart. This way, they were able to create loopholes that prevented African Americans from getting access to schools, but also to these other rights. But the case of, I think, of greatest importance to us in terms of looking at how the courts defined who had access to liberty, who had access to citizenship, is the important case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This occurred as a result of a law passed in Louisiana in 1890 called the Separate Car Act to apply to trains. What they essentially said in this law is that they had to have separate seating accommodations for African Americans and for whites on the trains. To contest this, in 1892, a man by the name of Homer Plessy decided to violate the law to create a test case to see if they could overturn it in court. He bought a first-class ticket in the eastern part of Louisiana, got onto the train, sat in a white-only car, and had himself arrested and put in jail and then released on bond the next day. They appealed it all the way through the state courts in Louisiana up to the Supreme Court. And in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled on this incident. And they ruled in a count of 7-1 that separate but equal was constitutional. What they were saying was that as long as the accommodations provided for both groups were equal, it was all right to have segregation, and there had no negative effect upon others. Now, one justice, Justice John Marshall, disagreed. He said that this is going to put a terrible burden on African Americans going forward, because he believed, and he was right, that the accommodations would not be separate and equal, but instead they would be separate and unequal. And he was indeed correct. And so, and almost from that point onward, for almost nearly another 50 years or more, separate but equal became the rule of the land, and its application as separate but unequal became the actual application of that idea. So what this reminds us of is the legacy of Reconstruction and the legacy of the courts in these settings, and the fact that we have to acknowledge that the laws and how they're interpreted by the Supreme Court have a lasting impact not only during the period of Reconstruction, but also into the period in which into the 20th century. Because I think for the next 50 or more years, you really have a real struggle by African Americans trying to exert the right that they have, all the rights of citizenship that should belong to someone else. As was mentioned in the introduction, I've just started writing about Thurgood Marshall, and that's the fight that he fought very strongly from the 30s to the 40s into the 50s, really trying to overcome the separate but equal ruling by the Supreme Court. And I think as we look at our courts today, we continue to see the courts as an important venue in order to look at the interpretation of laws and then how they're going to apply in the world in which we live. And I think the legacy of the decisions that happen in the court today are going to have repercussions far into the future, and things that we need to think about as we are thinking about who are citizens and how do we treat our citizens. But also, as we talked about Reconstruction, we wanted to make sure that we looked at what African Americans were doing and what they were going through. It's just not the courts, but it's also these newly freed individuals and how their lives were changing and how they were affecting the communities in which they were living. Now, we believe that they had a very strong, lasting effect. During this time period, African Americans were able to increase their access to education, not only at the elementary and secondary level, but actually at the college level. You have a number of historically Black colleges and universities that are created during this time period. Places like Fisk University, Howard, and Hampton, and others are all founded in the 1860s. You also have the rise of independent Black churches all across the country as African Americans created their own institutions that they could have control over and therefore meet together and talk about issues that confronted them in a place of safety. Also, you had formerly enslaved individuals looking to reconnect their families that were lost during the time that they were enslaved. And you have many, many stories of people wandering the country, putting ads in newspaper, checking in with churches, making announcements in a wide variety of places, trying to reconnect back to those families, reminding us how important family was to these communities and to these individuals as they were able to escape the bondage of slavery. Also, African Americans sought to own their own land. What they understood from the very beginning is that if you owned land, you could be economically independent. And that was a very strong push on their part, although it was a great struggle in order to get people to sell land to them. But what it did lead was to an increase in the number of African Americans who own land and to an increase in economic progress, in part during this time. And also what was very important during Reconstruction for African Americans is that they increased their involvement as elected government officials at the national level, but most importantly, at the local level as well. We have calculated through our work that there were more than 1,500 individuals at the local level who were able to hold positions as a consequence of Reconstruction and some of the laws that were originally passed by the Congress. Unfortunately, this does not last all throughout the 19th century. As Reconstruction winds down, the access that African Americans had to many of these things that I described are slowly taken away by these Black codes and by these segregation laws that I mentioned earlier. But what is important is that the work of the creation of these independent churches, of these independent Black institutions, allowed for the continuous cultivation of new leadership. And it laid the foundation for future Black leaders like John Lewis, who I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. He was a graduate of Fisk University, an historically Black college and university. And people like him who came out of these universities would become people who helped to lead the struggle, the civil rights movement that emerged in the 1950s and also afterwards. I think what this allows us to understand is that there are ripples of the impact of Reconstruction that continue today in our efforts to create a fair and a democratic society. And this is one of the things that this museum is very much interested in talking about and looking at and seeing how history provides a background and a foundation for understanding some of the challenges that we face today. And what we're trying to let people understand is that what they are doing has roots to it. And these roots are important to remember and understand. Because if they understand that, and if they understand, I think, the legacy that Reconstruction has left behind, it will help us to really increase our work towards creating a fair and democratic society. And this happens when we pursue the full rights of citizenship for everyone, as is put forward in our founding documents, when we create protests that protest the wrongful mistreatment and violence directed towards African-American women, men and women and others, but also when we take the time to register and vote in local elections. All these things, I think, were presaged in the period of Reconstruction. I think, and most importantly, Reconstruction reminds us that when we continue to strive equally to apply all the rights offered to American citizens in the Constitution, we are really embracing what was originally the idea coming into Reconstruction, that citizenship should be more broadly spread across the nation. I think if we do this by reflecting on Reconstruction and thinking about in the world we live today, we will have the opportunity to make the initial promise of Reconstruction, I think, come true. And I think if we do that, we will have the opportunity to bring our nation closer to the ideals on which it was founded, and which I think we all believe in as a basis or what makes our nation special. So with that, it gives you an overview of how the museum got started, what are some of the programs that we have, and basically what we're trying to do in some of our exhibitions. And I thank you for the opportunity to have a chance to talk with all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Crew. That was amazing. I will tell you that I grew up in Houston, Texas, and I went to school during the day, and at night my mother would set aside 2 hours for me to read the Negro Encyclopedia so that I could understand, how all of these policies and rules worked. So everything you just talked about was every night for 2 hours reading the Negro Encyclopedia. So thank you for bringing all of those things to the forefront, and thank you for your work. We really appreciate all that you are doing and the great asset that we have in Washington, D.C. So we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to start with one. What historic modern day impediments to voting persist for people of color in states? And which state has been the most, the worst?
I think it's hard to say who's the worst. I think that's a hard one to judge. I'd say that what we're finding are the problems are making access to voting locations hard, making the ability to register to vote hard as well. What you've seen in some states is that they've tended to close down the voting places in certain communities and not in others. They have not provided as many people to work at these voting locations in other communities. It was create long, long lines where people have to wait for hours sometimes to get the right to vote. And they also have made registering more difficult by making the criteria of things you have to provide in order to show that you are in fact a citizen of that community to register to vote harder as well. So I think these are some of the things that we see happening in terms of voter suppression. I think if you ask where the challenges might be great, I would think that one of the examples the last time around was in Georgia, where we almost had a new governor there who ran on the idea that if she could get more and more people registered to vote, she would have a better chance, but argued very vehemently that voter suppression was a very difficult problem in that state.
Oh, thank you. The next is, please discuss the U.S. and local government and people's protection, healthcare essential worker expectations of African Americans in past epidemics.
Let me see if I can think this one through. They're interested in this issue at a local level?
A U.S. and local government, yes.
Well, let me focus on the local level. I think that one of the things I talked about a bit in my presentation was the importance of the ability to vote and to elect officials. And sometimes we get so focused on the national elections that we don't think as much about the local elections and local individuals. But really, that's almost more important sometimes than at the national level, because at the local level, these the individuals are making decisions about what's going to happen in your city, in your county, in your district, in your part of your district in that city. So that by getting people in place who are sensitive to your issues, that helps to impact how these issues around health and around other questions are approached, and I think trying to be solved. And I would argue that making sure that we vote in all the cycles, not just the big national ones, but also the local ones, are really important in terms of trying to have impact upon that. In terms of the impact that it's having, I mean, I've had a chance to talk to some of the first responders down who are doing this work, and they are just sort of, I think, struck by how hard it's hitting these communities that are very, very vulnerable. And they're hit because of a couple of reasons. One, a distrust of health facilities because maybe they've not been treated carefully before. I think also because a lot of the people who work behind the scenes in these health facilities are, in fact, people of color, people who are poor, who are just as exposed, so that the impact of COVID-19 on those communities is much stronger. Plus, if you add in the questions of economics and where people are allowed to live, what kind of conditions they're forced to live under, and how people are forced to live close together and can't socially distance, it becomes a much harder process and has a greater impact in those communities. So I think those are all issues to be looked at and to be better understood, and hopefully to find some ways to ameliorate them going forward.
Thank you. Next question is, at a time of growing division in our country, how can the African American Museum and other nonprofits help bring people of different backgrounds together?
Well, I think what we have tried to do is we've created a portal called Talking About Race. And the whole idea is that if you begin to talk about it, and we try to do it in a facilitated fashion, it allows people to see each other as people and to judge people as people, not based on other kinds of characteristics. That portal begins with the whole idea of we all have biases. None of us is free of biases. So we need to understand that we have biases, understand what they are, and then with that knowledge, work to function in the world in a way that our biases don't impact how we deal with other people. The other thing I would say is that I mentioned a couple of programs that we had been doing before we closed in the museum. A seat at the table was the idea of bringing different people together to have them talk and get to know each other as people. And we've done other programs like that. So I think the key is to get different people talking to one another and begin to see each other as individuals with good and bad traits, as opposed to giving sort of a stereotypical view of one group versus another.
Thank you. One more question. Could you tell us about a few of the documents, materials, culture in the new Reconstruction exhibit?
Well, I think the key things we'll be looking at are some of the new institutions that are created by African Americans. We're also going to look at the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment, and talking with our scholarly advisors. They were very strong that we spend quite a bit of time talking about their impact, because they saw them as actually very revolutionary and really changing the direction of the nation in terms of their intent. And so we want to make sure we spend quite a bit of time looking at that. But we're also looking at some interesting documents in terms of labor contracts that African Americans are facing when they come out of enslavement, the sharecropper contracts and things like that. We're also interested in, I think what we have found fascinating are the ads in newspapers, where people are advertising and searching for family members and the stories that go with it. Some of them are heart-rending in terms of how people were separated from one another and how hard they're looking to find one another. So I think those are among the things that we look at. And also what we try to do is to make sure we don't just look at Reconstruction in terms of how it works in the past. We also want to look at Reconstruction's legacy today, and what are some of the things we see in our society today that I think reflect the hopes and dreams and the continuous work that needs to go on to make Reconstruction and its promise real and applicable in our lives.
Another question. Your background is at the Underground Railroad Museum. We have one of our viewers wanting to know more about what was the mission and the story behind the Underground Railroad.
Oh, good. Well, do you want the museum or the railroad itself? I can do either one.
All the above.
All of the above. Okay. Well, the National Museum, the National Underground Railroad Museum and Freedom Center was focused on the story of the Underground Railroad. And basically what the Underground Railroad was a group of individuals, I believe, who really truly believed in the words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and that one should treat each other as equal citizens. And they did not believe in the institution of slavery and were willing to take steps to try to undermine it by helping individuals who were ready to run away, those who were enslaved to run away, to go to freedom in the North and into Canada. So the impact and the focus of the Underground Railroad Freedom Center was to tell that story, to highlight those individuals and to get a sense of the kind of danger, the kind of, I think, strength of character, the kind of dedication that those who were part of the Underground Railroad had, as well as the desire for freedom that those who were enslaved had to try to escape, knowing that there was all kind of drawbacks if they were recaptured. So the heart of this is to say that there's the ability of a few people through the actions that they take through their personal commitment to help change the nation. Because many people will argue that among the reasons for the end of slavery and the launching of the Civil War was the work of people of the Underground Railroad who helped to awaken the nation, especially in the North, to what they felt were the inequalities of slavery and the need for the nation to work to bring an end to it.
Thank you very much. The next question, given the depth and continuation of demonstrations related to racial reckoning now unfolding, can you tell whether this is a significant point of change in reducing racism?
What I believe is that we are at a watershed moment for our nation, and what we don't know is watershed in which direction. I think the hope is that as we see more and more people understanding the validity of the issues that are being raised by the protesters and looking at how the society has treated different people differently, I'm heartened by the wide variety of people who are now becoming part of that movement, who are becoming part of the individuals who are saying we need to do things differently. We need to look at race. We need to look at how we intersect with each other in new kinds of ways, in better kinds of ways. I think if that continues to have momentum and that people truly embrace it, especially if we get people in positions of influence and power to embrace it and to look at how we do things, that it could be an important moment of change for the nation. Now, I'm cautiously optimistic, but we also understand that these things have their own sort of momentum to them, and we'll have to see how that momentum moves going forward.
How are you all partnering with other African American museums around the nation?
Well, we've, from the very beginning, partnered with others. In one sense, what we try to do is as we identify objects that help tell stories, we want to make sure that the local museums have a chance to look at those objects, and if they think they might work for them better, they have an opportunity to collect those objects. We do some programming collectively with those museums. And I think the biggest thing we do is that there is an African American Museums Association, and we work very closely with them regularly and have worked to help the museums who are part of that get expertise and training and support that they need as they're trying to mature and have a greater and greater impact in the communities where they're located.
One of our viewers has questions and would love you to talk more about the virtual exhibits and how can people access those exhibits.
Okay. Well, the easiest way to do that is to go to our webpage at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And we have different places where you can click on and go in and look at those exhibits. The most interactive one we have right now is the one I talked about for World War I. But we do have images from the other exhibits as part of that page as well. So that's the best place to go to learn more about what our exhibitions are and about some of our programs as well.
Well, thank you. Those were the questions that came in from the viewers. I have a question for you, though.
Sure.
So how are you working with non-African American museums?
Much the same way. What for me has been interesting is as you said from my resume, I've worked in the field a long time. So I have a lot of friends and colleagues across a wide variety of museums. And so what we try and do is to be of help to each other as needed. I've sat on consulting groups for other museums to help them talk about things they're trying to do. I give lectures at other places, as do other people of our staff. When people ask for help with collections and other things, we try to provide that as well. So we try to be a place that anyone who needs help in the museum field can at least turn to, if not for direct support from us, we can direct them to other places where they can get the kind of help that they need to accomplish their goals.
Thank you. Well, to expand upon that, one of our viewers asked a question: what significant parallels or contrasts do you see with the experience of Native Americans through the same time frames? I know that at Hampton University, there is, my mother used to talk about this all the time, there's a plethora of information on Native American and African Americans, the history at Hampton University. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, in general, what I can talk about is the intersection between the Native population and African Americans has varied over time and varied depending on where you are. We know there were points at which Native Americans enslaved some African Americans. We know there were moments in time when Native Americans sheltered African Americans. And it's not unusual for there to be a Native blood in the family line of African Americans as well. I think more importantly is that I think both groups were most often seen as others, and therefore not as good or as equal as other parts of the society, and have had to navigate that challenge throughout the long history of this country. Sometimes with success, very often with a lot of struggles and challenges and roadblocks put in their ways. So I would say that there are these parallels very much in terms of the experiences within the context of American history. And you're right, Hampton University was a place where you had a very strong Native population as part of the student population there.
Yes, my mother made me go there to study it, so I'm very familiar with that.
Well, I was going to mention too that an interesting issue was that soon we will be looking at the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa riots.
Yes.
In which what they call the Black Wall Street was destroyed. And what I was able to learn from some of my colleagues at the American Indian Museum is that a number of those individuals were, I think they were Creek and African American. And one of the reasons they had money to create these institutions, economic institutions, is they got some of the money from the resource money that came from some of the lands on which Indians were located. It was divided out. And they took that money to go to those places, so that it talks again about the intersections between our communities and how closely interwoven they are. You just have to sort of stop for a minute and really look at it more closely to understand how much they're connected.
Could you speak a little bit more about Abraham Lincoln and his legacy in advancing equality and justice for all?
Yes, I think I would see Abraham Lincoln as a person who grew and changed over time. I don't think he ever thought that slavery was right, but I think he thought it was something that just has to be accepted as part of the landscape. But I think over time that perception changed and grew. And I think as he got more involved in the presidency, more involved in the Civil War, he understood more and more the impact that slavery was having and the need to end that as part of the ongoing future of the nation. So I would see Abraham Lincoln as a man who grew and learned as he moved forward. And at the end was, in fact, as we know, an opponent of slavery and moved to have steps taken to end it.
Thank you. Another question. I've read that there is no mention of Clarence Thomas in the museum. Is that true?
No, it's not true. He's mentioned in the museum. There's an exhibition there. Yes.
Could you
Now,
elaborate on that?
here's what I'd like to say is that if they know Clarence Thomas, if we can get some objects from him, it would be even better. We've been talking to him to try to get objects to include in an exhibition, and we've not had any success. He might have been too busy, but if any of them have contacts and can get us some objects for the museum, they would be welcome.
Who are some of the notable African Americans that are highlighted in the museum?
Well, the first thing I want to point out is that the way the museum is set up is we're not looking to highlight individuals per se. We're looking at telling stories and telling the history of the country. And then what happens as you tell those stories, certain individuals pop up. We don't have exhibits on a person, but we have exhibits on events. Among the ones that I know the history exhibits. We have Harry Tubman, we have Frederick Douglass, we have Ida B. Wells, we have Booker T. Washington, we have Martin Luther King Jr., we have Malcolm X, we have a wide variety of people. It's probably too many to name. Probably you'll find most people touched upon somewhere in the museum, in the exhibitions. Because we also look at culture, we also look at education, we also look at fraternities, we also look at communities. So sprinkled throughout the museum, we look at the military. Sprinkled throughout the museum, you'll find lots of individuals who are part of larger stories.
So what do you hope to see in terms of race relations in the United States in the next 5 to 10 years? And what is the path forward?
If we knew the path forward, I think we would all be much better off. I think my hope is the one that I think you could hear John Lewis and others talk about, and that is that everyone's given an equal opportunity to be successful. That we recognize that creating that is not just in one place, but it's throughout the society, to take away the barriers that make it difficult for people to be able to reach their full potential. And that's in education, it's economically, it's in housing. There are a whole array of things that are in place that make it difficult for individuals to have success. And I would hope that we would work towards more and more of that, and recognizing that we have things we need to do as a society to really reach the ideals that we believe are so important to the essence of who we are. The path forward, I think, is to try and make sure we put into office people who we believe are going to do the things we want to have happen, and to hold them accountable for making those steps once they're in office.
Okay, we've had a ton of questions come in, so I'll try to get through all of them.
Okay.
In this increasingly anti-fact, anti-intellectual, anti-critical thinking era, have you seen any trends in museum attendance and museum stability that might shed some light? For example, it was disheartening to see the museum close and to see the attacks on the 1619 project. Are Americans losing their inquisitiveness and sense of history, or has that too become hyper-politicized?
Well, I think history has always been pretty politicized, because history can have different interpretations and different meanings, and that's where some of the disagreements occur. What I will say about the African American Museum where I work is that the attendance there has been terrific. We also, the diversity of people who come to our museum to look at the history there has been terrific as well. So from our perspective, I would say we don't believe that interest in history, interest in getting new perspective is waning, but it's still very strong. I think that history museums and museums in general, not just history museums, but museums in general, probably don't have the same level of visitorship they might have had in the late 1990s. And I think part of that really has to do with all the alternative forms of entertainment that exist that people can turn to. And also the ability to more and more visit museums digitally, which means you don't get attendance counted through the gate, but you do get a lot more people using the resources that are available there. And I will say that in this post-COVID-19 world in which we live, use of our online resources has increased dramatically as people are looking for information and data that they can use in trying to teach their students, trying to teach their children with their parents at home, and in general, just trying to find more information that they can use in different kinds of ways.
What book would you recommend that would help people understand systemic racism?
Wow. What I would say is we offer a number of book choices on our Talking About Race portal. And I would suggest that people should go to that and look at the resource page and look at some of the books there and see what titles resonate for them, rather than me saying one book versus another.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Please discuss the state of Brown vs. the Board of Education. In today's institutions such as public education and policy, is this current state reflected in our courts, BLM movement?
What's the last part of it?
Is this current state reflected in our courts, BLM movement?
I mean, the Brown versus Board of Education?
Mm-hmm.
I guess what I would say is that the key part of Brown versus the Board of Education was saying that segregation was no longer acceptable in law. I think in law that still holds true more often than not, but what has overcome it is sort of local traditions and other things that people do that don't directly confront the law, but still do not embrace the law fully. And I think it also connects to how people are feeling about equal treatment under the law in the way that's enforced, and a feeling that it's being enforced in different ways in different communities with different people, and that the hope is that we can get to a stage where it's enforced uniformly in all communities in the same kind of way, and people can feel great confidence in the enforcement of those laws, not worry about side things that might happen that might prove fatal or hurtful to them.
Okay, to tag on to that comment, in the 50 years since Civil Rights Movement and Civil Rights Act, what do you consider the greatest achievements from that legislation?
Well, I think the greatest achievement was to strike down the separate but equal concept, because until then, segregation was allowable. And the courts had said it was fine. So by them saying that no longer would be something they would support as the highest law interpreter of the land, it really began to break down the application of segregation in a wide variety of areas, not only in schools, but in other areas as well. And I think that followed up with the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act are really important laws in terms of opening up opportunity and opening up the ability to influence politics and influence how people in office operate as a consequence of having to be more responsible to the voters located in the district where they live. So I see those things as sort of the legacy of Brown versus the Board of Education. What we're still struggling with, as I said, is that there are still traditions and ways of operating that don't fully embrace that. And I think our hope is that more and more the way we operate will reflect this belief that everyone should be treated equally.
Thank you. This has been amazing, Dr. Kruth. Thank you so much for joining us today. Any last points of view or thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I think, well, one, just thanks for allowing me to speak with you. To talk a bit about the museum. I think that what I will say, what we say for our museum is that we are really trying to help make people see more about African American history, but also to think about the world in new kinds of ways that really hinge around the idea of social justice and treating our fellow citizens in the way we want to be treated ourselves.
Well, thank you. It's been a special treat. We appreciate you being here today. And thank you to all the viewers out there. And we hope you will join us for our next online event on August 26th, when our guest will be from Monticello, featuring Gail Jessup White, Community Engagement Officer and a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and 2 enslaved families at Monticello, and the Hubbards, along with the Monticello Associate Curator, Dr. Emil Johnson. And for more information, visit o'connorinstitute.org. And thank you again for being with us. And thank you again, Dr. Crew.
Right. Thank you.